Hello. Hi. Excellent response. Great energy. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lit House. We're here for our kickoff event of both the Literary House series and the Sophie Kerr series for this year, the 2023-2024 academic year. Sophie Kerr, over 50 years ago now, left an extremely generous donation to the English department at Washington College. She was a native of Denton, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. And although she herself did not go to Washington College as a student, she visited briefly and received an honorary degree next to Eleanor Roosevelt, and was so utterly impressed, as she should be, with this fine institution that she realized there would be no better place to give the small fortune that she had accumulated in a life in letters than to this college. She was herself a journalist, like our esteemed guest today, Amy Güth, a magazine editor, a writer, a publisher, a novelist, a short story writer. And I'm sure if she had lived long enough, she too would have been a podcaster and a screenwriter as well. And so this year, the theme of our Sophie Kerr series is screenwriting. We're bringing 6 fabulous screenwriters who in many cases are also multi-hyphenates doing many different things to campus for the delectation and knowledge of all of you, our community. In an exciting interview that Amy Güth gave, she actually commented on, at one point, seeing a former teacher standing in front of a bookcase and looking melancholic, and commenting to her that it's just so sad to contemplate all the knowledge there is in the world and how little time in which we have to learn everything. And the absolute best remedy I know for that problem is to come to events like the Sophie Kerr series and the Lit House series and learn from those who are actively changing the world and participating in it in the life of letters. And so that said, I want to introduce my colleague Roy Kesey to speak on behalf of the Lit House and introduce Amy Güth.
Thank you, Dr. Riedel. That was terrific. Good afternoon. Look at this full house. I like the feel of this a lot. We are here to start things off for this year, and it's going to be a good year. Thank you for joining us for this craft talk that is, as Dr. Riedel said, the kickoff event for the 6-author screenwriting series that the Rose O'Neill Literary House and the Sophie Kerr Committee have teamed up to bring you. We here at the Lit House, that is I myself, Dr. James Allen Hall, our director, Amber Talianisic, our assistant director, and Linda Hamrick, our new center coordinator. We are so grateful to our colleagues in the English department for joining us in this effort, and to our colleagues in other departments as well, CMS and environmental science, among others, for their help co-sponsoring certain of the events. My name is Roy Kesey. I am the Associate Director of the Lit House, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the producer, screenwriter, journalist, and writer, Amy Güth. As it turns out, Amy and I have known each other for years. We first met on social media. I think it was Blue Sky. Was it Blue Sky? Mastodon? Couldn't have been Twitter. It wasn't Facebook. There wasn't anything before Facebook. People, it was MySpace. We met on MySpace. How to even explain MySpace to the youth of today? Like Facebook, but dumber. This was 2005, 2006, somewhere in there, and Amy was living in Chicago. I was living in China. Our respective first books were about to come out, and that was one of the first things that I knew. I don't know if you had it as your profile icon or whatever, the cover of Three Fallen Women. I think so, right? And it was this fabulously striking image, highly stylized, focused in far enough that you couldn't quite be sure what you were looking at, but you knew it was beautiful. And I asked her, and it turned out that it was, well, her brother got a nosebleed and like bled into the sink, and then he's a photographer, and he was like, huh, and took a picture of that. And so that, filtered in various ways and focused in tight on, was the cover of the book. And that was when I learned that thing about Amy Güth, that finding beauty in pain and in difficulty is kind of her deal. Finding truth and value in stories, especially underreported stories, not just in the content of those stories, but in the act of communicating them. That is kind of her whole deal. Not her whole deal. She has other deals. Other things that I've learned about her include that she absolutely does not believe that we need to limit ourselves to doing a single thing in this life, especially a single thing at a time. In fact, she finds the suggestion insulting. And so for the next 15 years or so, I watched as she climbed the ladder of journalism, from her work at the Chicago Tribune, editing their digital book section, to the decades she spent hosting a talk radio program at WGN in Chicago, discussing the most salient socio-political issues of the day, to her run as publisher of the Tribune Publishing Company's Red Eye, which was a daily commuter newspaper. For most people, those things would be enough. That would be enough to keep you busy, but it wasn't for Amy Güth. While she was doing those things, she was also a senior facilitator at the Op-Ed Project, an academic media initiative aimed at increasing the diversity of voices in the public narrative, where she edited and shaped essays and opinion pieces in dozens of outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, U.S. News and World Report. She's worked with universities, including Brown and Cornell and Columbia, and foundations, including the Ford Foundation, Schusterman, and the Aspen Institute's Center in Johannesburg, South Africa. She also served as executive director of the Midwest Independent Film Festival, founded the Pilcrow Lit Fest in Chicago, served as president of the board of directors at both Bitch Media and the Association for Women Journalists, and founded a reading series that I read at in 2006, something like that, 7 maybe, yeah, when my first book came out. So all of that. And then, in her own words, a few years ago, she saw how quickly she had climbed the ladder and realized that the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall, is how she phrased it. What that meant was that the next few years would be thinking through the things that she most loved doing, the things that she was best at, and beginning the process of blowing up her life such that she could spend more of it doing those things. Still doing some journalism, still doing the podcast for Cranes, moving from Chicago to LA to focus more and more exclusively on her career as a screenwriter, as a producer, and as a writer. Her fiction and essays have appeared in many publications, including the Los Angeles Review of Books, Los Angeles Times, and The Believer. Story South cited one of her stories on its notable list. She was a nominee for a Million Writers Award. There are several anthologies I could name. That's as an essayist and a short story writer. She is also, and primarily, and this is why she is here today, an award-winning screenwriter, having written Open Road, 1,000 Cuts, The Mender, among other projects, and producer, having most recently produced and just seen with the color correction, Elvis of the Yukon, which is still in post, filmed in the Pacific Northwest, and La Mitad del Mundo, a Spanish-language documentary about sex trafficking in Ecuador, which is currently in film festivals, having won the, help me with the name of the award, at the Ocean City Film Festival, the Audience Choice Award. Thank you. Still, as I said, host of the Daily Business, Technology, and Economics podcast for Crane's Chicago Business, where she was a finalist for the 2019 The Saiger Award. And she also does a lot of voiceover and ad work, so you will hear her as the Don Pardo-like announcer on VSIN and Better Network national programming, about 300 radio stations across the country. These are the things that led Washington College to reach out to ask her to be the first guest in this year's Lit House Sophie Kerr Screenwriter Series. Here today to give a craft talk about the process of adapting literature and other texts for the big screen. Please turn your cell phones off and help me welcome Amy Güth.
Thank you for all being here today. It's nice to see you all. I hope this can be a discussion, so if you have questions, I'll save some time at the end, but if something's kind of gnawing at you as we go, just give me a wave or jump up and down or something, and we'll get into it, because I want to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. So yes, let's talk about adaptations, because it's a really special place in the screenplay world, and I want to get into some specific things, excuse me, that you run into with adaptations and how I worked through them. So I'll give you a couple of examples that I worked through. But I want to kind of open up by talking about some book to film adaptations. What is the narrative usually? The book was better, right? Isn't that usually the thing people say? So what are some adaptations that come to mind when you think about work that's been adapted for screen? It becomes more dramatic. Can you think of a particular work that stands out? Yeah. Harry Potter, that's a great example. So do you like the book or the movie better?
I never read the book.
So your team movie. Okay, fair. Team movie. All right, yeah. What's that? Great. Other examples? Wow, here we go. Yes. Pride and Prejudice, yes. And even that like side, remember for a while there was like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, like another whole genre of things. Yeah. Hunger Games, yes, yes. I saw a hand, yeah. Lord of the Rings, that's a great example. Yes. Yes, definitely. The 8 million Frankenstein adaptations, yes. Pretty Little Liars. Yeah. Right. And there's a lot of work like that. I always think it's interesting to keep an eye on what's entering the public domain, because that's when you start seeing like every version of a thing, right? And so indeed, often the book gives us something, and when we see it on screen, we're like, oh, that character got changed. Or that thing that really spoke to me, that thing that really, really spoke to my heart wasn't in the movie. Therefore, it's not good, right? But what about when the reverse happens? When you're like, okay, the book was fine, but the movie was whoa. Can you think of any examples of that? Yeah. Jurassic Park. And why do you think it was better on screen? Yeah. Right. Yeah, they condensed a lot. It gave you a visual way to understand a thing. There was no math. Yeah. 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 Fair. Other examples? Yeah.
Wait, you call on me?
Yeah.
So a common example I see of sometimes the movie being better than the book is expanding a short story
Mm-hmm.
into a feature film.
Yes. Yes.
So like the Shawshank Redemption.
Yes, that's a great example. That's a great example. Yes. The Shining is a great example. You know what? I have a special relationship with The Shining because my parents were winter caretakers of a hotel in North Carolina when I was little, and I used to roll around it on a tricycle. So when I saw that movie, it scared the crap out of me because I was like, yes, accurate. Not totally accurate, but spooky enough. Yes. Yes. Stardust. Great. Did I see another hand over here? Yeah. I'm glad that you brought The Godfather up because that's on my list, the three that I point to a lot. There was a book about a shark. Anybody remember that one? Peter Benchley wrote it. No, but everybody sure knows the music that went to Jaws, right? And suddenly all you have to do is 2 notes of that song, dun-na, and everybody knows what you're about to do, right? The Godfather is a great example. Interestingly, in workshops, I've used the Godfather screenplay because it's in my opinion, kind of flat, because Mario Puzo wrote it with Francis Ford Coppola, so some liberties could be taken, right? Coppola was able to go, I got that part, we just need to get the bones. I got stuff going on in my director mind, we can keep going on this. No Country for Old Men, that's debatable, right? Really good book, Cormac McCarthy, also really good movie, Coen Brothers, right? And that's a kind of a contentious one, because people really love different aspects of that one. People really love stuff about that movie, but some people really love stuff about that book, right? And so it doesn't always end up being the case that the book was better, right? That narrative isn't always exactly accurate. But what happens, what we've lost when we do get to that point, is often because a thing that was so moving and special and magical to us in the book didn't make it to the film. And there's a lot of reasons for that, some of which we'll talk about. But there's also a way to preserve some of those things. And there's also a way to use that to decide what to even adapt in the first place. And we're going to play with that a little bit. But first, before we get into those examples, I want to talk a little bit about how I got into adaptation. The very first thing that I was doing with screenplay adaptation was adapting my own journalism to video. Because there were things that you can describe. In particular, I was talking to someone who had lost his family. His parents and his sibling had all been shot. And he was talking about it, and I was describing him in reporting. And that did it justice, but there was these long pauses of silence where he had this anguished look on his face. And I could say that in the story, but I could also put a camera on him. And that became a little bit different thing. And those two pieces were both perfectly valuable works. The article about him and the foundation that he created was perfectly fine, but also a video of him explaining it became a standalone thing that was also completely valid work, right? And so they can exist both on their own. They don't necessarily have to be a tug of war. And that was really that first sort of epiphany that I had about adapting things. And it was in that documentary sort of way. From there, I started into screenplays because I think it's such an interesting medium. And it challenged me in the way that journalism did. Just as there's no I in journalism and you just report down the middle and you put the facts and you don't put anything in there that you can't prove, there are bumpers in screenplays. And that is, there's no Mary looked out the window and realized she loved Brian. There's no realized. You have to show it. Every single piece of it has to be visual. And that became didn't really, he wanted to kind of sit on it for a while. He was like, okay, we got this done, but let's just wait. Let's not submit it to any contests or anything yet. And I was like, yeah, okay, no problem. And proceeded to immediately enter any contest. And I felt like, oh, maybe that was a little bit of an act of self-sabotage or something, so I'm just going to work around that. Not that I'm advising you to betray your creative collaborators, but it worked out, and we ended up getting some awards. We got some visibility. And a short time later, I had the rights to a love that story so much. I've insisted so many people that I gotta read it. So when I had the chance to adapt it, I was absolutely the conversation with David Morrell was like, yeah, go for it. Like, it's been around since 1988, have at it. Because I approached it like, if no one else has the rights, like, I'd love to have a shot at this. He was like, by all means, right? And kind of issued a little bit of a warning, not really warning, but like, it's a pretty internal story. It's pretty weird little story. So interesting, I'll be interested to see what you do with it. And indeed, that was kind of the first challenge, right? Of taking some of those internal things that happen to this character. So we're kind of following this grad student as he's like, I'm gonna be the one who doesn't die like the painter. I'm gonna study this guy and figure out why all these people died just like him. And essentially, what happens is everyone that studied him, they kind of, not only do they die the same way, but they sort of descend into this mental health crisis and they start painting profusely and all this stuff happens and it gets very intense. And so the way to show that became very visual in this, right? So it wasn't just like a line saying the intensity heightened, you know, the struggle became worse. How do you show that? So I depicted that as showing a lot of like half-done paintings around student housing and a lot of behavioral kind of stuff, right? Because the other challenge I wanted to speak to was there's like movie, TV, crazy, right? That we kind of all know what that looks like in a big theatrical way. But in fact, a real mental health crisis doesn't look like that, right? We've either all experienced it or witnessed it, right? And in fact, it's kind of quiet and boring until it's scary, right? And I wanted to capture that and be really intentional about doing it that way. So that became about the physical things in the environment around the characters. And that became behavioral things with the character. Ultimately, what happens in the book is that, or in the story, is that this guy that says, I'm gonna be different, I'm gonna be the guy that doesn't get obsessed with this painter and die the same way. He decides to go find all the locations of this painter's work. And he finds all but one, and then he finally finds that one. And there's this loud buzzing, and this painter was an impressionist painter, right? So all the little dots. And there's this loud buzzing as he's approaching this spot. And as he gets right up to it, he realizes, this is the one I've been looking for. This is it, I found it finally. And as he approaches something, and the book doesn't say, the book just says something flies at him and hits him in the eye. So it could be like extraterrestrial, it could be imagined, it could be a lot of different things. And I chose to keep that vague because the author did. But what happens is in the story, when he opens his eyes, it's not that this guy was an impressionist painter, it's that the world looked that way after that. And the only way to relieve the tension was to paint it ferociously, constantly, obsessively. And so that was a big journey. And so leading up to that, and there's some special effects details in there, right? There'll be some sound cues, things like that. But leading up to that, I chose to make that impactful by, what the book says is, he traveled up a hill through a ravine. So I made that very detailed and a physical struggle to get him there. And then a big physical struggle with a lot of pain to get him back. And talking about holding his eye and a headache that, you know, that he was holding his head and things like that, that he's wincing and that he gets beat up, he's in bramble and things like that. So I created physical components to help aid along that emotional, that mental health struggle. And that was an effective tool to bring that through. There were some things to be added. I would say of all the adaptations I've done, this particular one was the most literal. It's probably the closest to the original story. But there was a line it was like one or two lines actually. It said something like, we met in grad school and immediately became very close friends. So how do you accomplish that in a screenplay, right? So what that meant was I needed to add a scene at the beginning of grad school to show him moving into this grad school housing, because that was really, really important. That's these two people meeting is how he first learns about this artist. So sometimes even two little tiny lines can become scenes because they're important lines. And that's a really key thing of where you scale back and where you push forward and where you scale back. And so the other example, to expand on that a little bit, is The Same River Twice, which is a memoir that I co-adapted with the author. So the one I was just talking about, the author of that, he was like, Godspeed, let me know when it's done. It is now done. It's in early development. But for this one, for The Same River Twice by Pam Mandel, part of acquiring the rights was that she was going to write it with me. And she had never written a screenplay, so there was a little bit of a teaching component of showing her how to do that, and showing her what, not only the mechanical and formatting things were, but that you couldn't say Mary looked out the window and realized she loved Brian. You had to show that in a different way. And that was very, very challenging with this particular book, because it is almost a monologue. It is very internal. And the story of The Same River Twice, which I recommend that you read, it's a really interesting story, is the story of a young woman, and it's a memoir, it's her life. After high school in 1980, she didn't really have a plan, so her dad sent her to live on a kibbutz, a working farm in Israel. At the time, there was a lot going on politically in the world. So she's there, she's working on this farm. She has a couple of relationships that are kind of progressively worse, until she's kind of at this low point in which she gets involved with someone who's ultimately her abuser, and she's traveling with him. And there's a lot of internal struggle that's in that book, talking about how she felt traveling with her abuser. So getting that onto the page was really challenging. But the first challenge really was setting the tone for that. She spends chapters and chapters in the book talking about the time and place. So she's talking about all the different groups of young people that came to work in this kibbutz. So Thatcherism is happening in the UK. So a lot of young people in England who are entering the workforce are like, can't find a job, I'm gonna go work on this kibbutz because at least room and board are covered, and I can work and earn a little bit of money. And coal is happening in Germany, so that's affected people still, so a lot of German young people are there working. And so we can't exactly spend chapters and chapters and chapters. A screenplay is 90 to 120 pages tops, right? We can't spend all these chapters to explain Thatcherism, right, just to get us there. So we did kind of a fun device, and we called it our Wes Anderson trick, but it's not really borrowed from him, but maybe. We have her in voiceover. We have this character talking about, here's all the people you will meet at a place like this. Cut to group of American kids all in a t-shirt that says volunteer. This is us, this is why we're here. Our parents sent us here. Cut to a bunch of British kids, and we have them in like British flag shirts and doing stuff. And it says, they're all screwed by Thatcherism, so they came here to find a job. Cut to German kids. And we condensed chapters and chapters and chapters of political explanation down to a few lines of voiceover with a visual for each. So there's interesting tools that you can use. And the temptation, I think, when beginning adaptation is to go line by line, to translate everything visually. And you have to really ask yourself, what is essential to this story? And there's hard choices. In The Same River Twice, part of kind of a subplot is that she lives with her dad, and before she's sent to Israel, she lives with her dad and stepmother, and her mom is kind of absent from her life, and that's a theme. The mom doesn't really play that big a role in the screenplay, and ultimately it was kind of distracting to include the mom character. That's really not the story. The story is really this young woman who gets away from her abuser while she's traveling with him. And so we ultimately felt like the mom character was going to pull away from it, and we cut that. It was a very difficult conversation, candidly, while collaborating with the author. We were working up to that point, and I was trying to figure out the right way to say, hey, we need to remove your mom from this story. And her mom died. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to hit pause on that conversation for a couple weeks and let that settle. But what happened after that was that ultimately she came right back and said, you know, with this break, thank you. Hold that thought. I'm talking entirely too much, my throat's so dry. Pardon me. So she came back from that and she said, I'm not upset about her mom, I'm just coughing. Give me a second. Talk amongst yourselves about things. There we go. Yeah. Yeah, great.
3 hours.
I was gonna say
I don't know. It was like Dinamon Zone.
Wicked, Enchanted, Nelson.
There we go. Okay, I sound normal again. Test, test, test. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. We had to reset for a second. Oh, the joy of live events, right? And I have more water coming. Hero. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. So when she came back from that little hiatus, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to tell her we can't really keep going because writing the mom in is difficult. And we came back and she said, you know, I've been thinking about on this break, I think we should cut my mom. She came to it herself because at that point she was starting to realize every word in a screenplay needs a job. I mean, arguably that's with anything we write, but especially in a screenplay. Not only does every word need a job, it needs a visual job. Because again, you have 90 to 120 pages, whereas you might have, you know, a few hundred in a novel. So that became a very big challenge there with that. Another way that we use kind of condensing timelines and played with form a little bit was kind of similar to that Wes Anderson thing. We needed to show this series of partners that she had to lead up to her meeting this abuser. We don't meet him till halfway through the book, but he's a big deal. He's kind of the whole deal of the book, right? So how could we spend half the screenplay getting to him when there's a whole bunch of travel and stuff after him? So we created a scene that was in a bomb shelter. There's an air raid, you know, happening, and she's in a bomb shelter, and suddenly she's pointing to different boys that she's in this bomb shelter with. And we use that same kind of quick shift. So it's like, whoosh, that's Adam. Wish he could be my boyfriend, but kissed him once and kind of felt like kissing my brother. Whoosh, this is Eli, super hot guy. We'll get back to him. Whoosh, this is so-and-so. Had a little bit of thing. Turns out he had 6 girlfriends. Whoosh, this is Alistair. We'll talk about him later. That's the abuser. We wanted to set up that he was there all along. So we played with this thing and condensed pages and pages and pages. And then we go back to hot Eli, right? That she said, we'll get back to him. So she has a relationship with Eli. He breaks her heart. And that kind of opens the door to the abuser. Because he kind of smells blood in the water. She's in a vulnerable place. And he swoops in. And that becomes the start of their relationship. So we needed to show that she kind of goes through this progression. But we needed to do it fast. So we used, for a pretty serious topic, we used some things that felt kind of light and funny. And we were able to accomplish both things, right? To get to some serious topics while condensing things that were important, right? And I think that's such a big part of what the game is with adaptation of what do you include and how do you do it? Because there's some things you're like, well, I can't not use that. That's got to be there. But I can't go on for 10 pages about it. It's a valuable exercise to just write it, get it done. You can always scale back. But then decide, how can I do this more economically? How can I learn about formatting or camera stuff and think about this in a different way of how this might be edited to be condensed in a really small way where you in fact say a lot more and you're able to communicate a lot more. So I think that's a really kind of key part of it too. Which kind of lands us at this place of what do you adapt and why? What makes something good enough to adapt? So I want us to take a few minutes, turn to the person next to you, make a friend if you don't know them already, and name a work of journalism, a short story or a novel that you think would be great to adapt into a film, and tell them why you think it should be a film. Go for it. wrap up?
What's that?
That wrap up will be quick. Yeah. Okay. Great.
It's funny. I was thinking about there's a Kieslowski quote. He was just talking about unfilmable sentences. Like that's kind of awesome. But I never really thought about it from the screenwriter's point of view. And you must be like, what an asshole. Why would you do that on purpose?
Yeah. Why would you do that?
And his example was great. His example was he came to see her less and less often until finally he didn't come by. It's like,
Oh my God.
film it.
Why would you do that? I would show her at the window and seasons passing.
Right? But like, so he has to come twice in December or 4 times
And
in
then she
December.
needs to sit there
once
the
in
whole
January,
winter.
Right? And take you 45 minutes to film this.
Yes. I hate that guy for that.
So instead, you just have her talking to a friend and saying, he came less and less often until finally he never did.
Yeah, that's right. He hasn't visited me in ages. That's what. Yeah.
Thank
Let's
God
see.
for that.
Let's see. How they doing? I feel like some people are wrapping up.
See, this is how you know that what you said is working.
Yeah, they're
They
doing it.
fucking want to talk about
Yeah, they're doing it. Immediately, I heard someone over there say, "Okay, this is perfect because I'm totally doing that." It's good. Raise your hand if you want another minute. Raise your hand if you'd like another minute. You got it? Yes, you have it. Who wants to share? Nobody wants to share. Literally nobody. Crickets. Man. So, there we go. Thank you. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Cool. Anybody else? Yeah.
Well, this is actually something I've actually been working on.
Awesome.
Into a screenplay. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of the book series Kingdom Keepers. Well, it's a Disney book series about a bunch of kids who essentially get superpowers at nighttime and wake up in Disney World at night to fight Disney villains.
I'm in.
And it's surprisingly dark for
Okay.
a children's book series with that premise. So.
Wow, that's so in your mind, is that a one or is that several?
Well, I mainly liked the first book the best since it's its own self-contained story, and I think that first book would work well as a movie, and I think that could spawn in like a sequel. There's like 15 books in this series, so I don't know if like it would be hard to adapt all of them, but just jumping off of the first one would be like an interesting movie-going experience for somebody who has never read the series.
For sure. And film funders love adaptations that are part of a series because they translate that into there can be more of these. Excellent. Anybody else want to share? Yes.
I would say it was supposed to be, but it got canceled. College Boomer, it canceled them.
Okay. All right.
A story about Harry Truman. The book is called Watchdog.
Okay.
So it's a sort of a biography, and it just covers a short period of time from when he was a nobody junior senator from Missouri to when Roosevelt chooses him to become vice president. And he's only vice president for a few months. Roosevelt must know that he's on the way out.
Mm-hmm.
So what he's really looking for is the next president. And the way Truman came to that prominence was through a procurement committee of the U.S. Senate that watched out for misspending of the public dollar as goods and equipment, foodstuffs, and so forth were produced for the troops.
Interesting. So is the thing that speaks to you about that would make it an interesting film that it's just kind of this little detail that perhaps history's kind of overlooked a bit?
The thing that speaks to me about is that emergencies make the person come forward and meet the emergency.
Sure.
And Harry Truman wasn't not one that one would expect to do it.
Right.
However, he always had the traits that were necessary.
Yeah.
He just hadn't been put in a position to make it really worthwhile for the country.
Yeah, that's interesting. Plus, I love stories that are about people we think we know all about them. And here's this little thing not a lot of people know. Yeah.
I grew up reading Magic Treehouse.
Okay.
And I always thought like it'd be really cool to get like a visual of that because like as a kid
what visual, when you imagine that as a film, what's the visual that comes in?
I don't know. I just feel like, I mean, even now, I think it would just be really cool to just like, I guess with like all the visual effects, like how the treehouse would like vanish and stuff like that,
Mhm.
and like they go to different parts of the history of time and stuff like that. So each book, and like I guess like in a movie that'd be hard because there were so many books of it, but it'd really be really cool to see like how they would, I guess like create each like different time period that they went back to and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So.
There would be set designers lining up for your screenplay. They're like, I would get a set in every era. I'm in. Yes. Cool. Anybody else want to share? Yeah.
I said Crime and Punishment. Just thought it'd be a good like psychological kind of film.
Interesting. And would you be pretty true to the story, or would you adapt it to be modern, or what would you do?
I'd probably like stick to the story.
Mm-hmm.
In its time period and everything else.
Yeah.
The book is very descriptive, so
Sure.
there's not a lot of room for creativity if I were to do that, but it's okay.
There's always room for creativity. Yeah.
My friends came up with the idea of the fall of the House of Usher.
Oh, okay. Wow. And why that?
Do you guys want to share? We were thinking pretty much just anything Edgar Allan Poe, but it's very descriptive and it's very visceral in the way that it's described. I think it could translate really well to film.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they're short and concise.
Yeah.
But we thought the very last scene in the fall of the House of Usher with everything crumbling is
Yeah.
very interesting.
There's another set designer that would be like, ooh, when I'm done with his treehouse, I'm going to go to this. But also the CGI folks would be like, I'm in on the crumbling. Right. Definitely. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, that whole thing. Sure. Yeah. Oh. And why that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think short stories are some of the coolest work to adapt because you have space, right, to build out with it. Oh, yes. Oh. Sure. Sure. You had one too?
I did. I hate to like go a little bit off to a different kind of.
You go where you want to.
I'm currently in a very storyboarding phase of adapting Resident Evil 7's Biohazard.
Wow. Okay.
But like pre-infection.
Okay.
Like when they find Mia and bringing her in and bringing in the infection and watching that family crumble and subdue to their infection is what I think would be really fascinating to bring to a screen because it's already so horrific.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't really get the family dynamic pre-infection.
Right.
So it would bring a different kind of flavor to it that most Resident Evil adaptations suck at.
Right. That's an interesting idea. And so it kind of leads to this bigger question, right? Is it the psychological piece that speaks to us? Is it the visual thing that speaks to us? What is the thing that says this work would be good? This would be a great thing to adapt. And I'll give you another example from The Same River Twice of what the thing is to me that you really want to look for, because you can have visual all day, but there's got to be a story. And there's got to be some emotional appeal, but there's got to be visual. You have to find all of those things. And so what I'm looking for when I'm thinking about work to adapt is kind of this density of expression. And what I mean by that is the first scene of Same River Twice. Here's this kid from suburban Orange County, California, who's gone to live in Israel. She's at a Shabbat dinner and looks out the window as they're setting the table. And she goes, "Oh, are those fireworks?" And the kid goes, "We have to go to the bomb shelter now, right now. We're going." And the family, no nonsense, gets up and starts to exit. And she's like, "Well, are the fireworks or what?" They're like, "Rockets, go now." And so in a second, you understand the baseline of this character arc, You know exactly where she's starting from. You see that she is completely fish out of water. Suddenly, she is in a place where she is completely not aware of what's normal there. You see the context of the place. You see a powerful visual. And what spoke to me about that one even is that the identical visual meant something different to two different people. It was, is this a celebration or these fireworks? And to a person who saw it every day said, we might have a rocket on our heads, let's get into the bomb shelter. And so to me, that was a powerful expression of the time, the place, the context, what you're setting your viewer up for, what's about to happen in this story. Suddenly you saw a lot about this character, and it did a lot of work for you. And it brings in these psychological elements. At the same time, it brings you visual stuff. And those are those kind of very rich moments that I think are important to look for when you're thinking about adapting work. There's a lot of great work that isn't always great on screen. There's a lot of work that's great on screen, right? It can go a lot of different ways. And that's about using tools and a bunch of, some of the mechanics of script development to speak to that and to get into that. But when we think about what we want to adapt, it's not enough to just love it, right? That helps because screenplays, those of you who have written one, are a slog, and they're long, and you're going to need some love in your heart for those hard parts at the end when you're getting to that final draft. So it's not enough to just love it. You have to have this thing that that makes you so convinced this will be a powerful story, both visually and emotionally. And that is the place I start from. So I said at the top that I want to make this a conversation. So we've got time. I got nowhere to be. So until you got somewhere to be, let's talk about stuff that's on your mind about this topic. Yeah. Yeah.
You said how when you adapt, you leave details out. But for people who like read books and love the books, how do you make it so they will enjoy it, or they won't feel like there's something missing?
That's really the trick. You have to decide what to leave out. And that's why it matters to get the right screenwriter. If you are an author and you're approached about your work being adapted, it probably behooves you to get to know that screenwriter a little bit and their work and see, is this really the right person for my work, to adapt my work? Or to say, like in the case of The Same River Twice, yeah, go for it, but I want to be involved, right? And that's kind of how part of that is answered. But on the same token, it's not really about I'm making a screenplay to make the book reader happy. It's I'm making a completely standalone thing. The example I started with by talking about adapting my own written journalism reporting into video was both of those things. You could come to either of them and access the other or not. You could come to just the video and get it, and it's fine. And that might lead you to my reporting. You could come to just the reporting, and it's fine, and it captures what you need to know, and it might lead you to the video, and if it not, it's fine. Both of those things are standalone, and one's not necessarily made to appease the reader of the other or the viewer of the other. It's just another layer and another way to tell a thing. And I think they're both totally valid forms, right? And it's a matter of, really when you adapt work, saying what is so resonant about this work that's important to me to keep, and what's kind of distracting, what's a part that doesn't necessarily need to be there or could be reduced to a line of dialogue. And that becomes kind of a slippery slope, right? Because very exposition-heavy dialogue is pretty torturous. The trick with screenplays, and I think something that has been a huge advantage for me coming into it as a journalist, was journalists, we meet people on the best and worst day of their lives. We don't meet people on a random boring Wednesday. We meet them when they've just won an Oscar or when their house is just burned. And so usually the first thing out of their mouth is not exposition, it's they start right with the story. And I think that's something I brought into writing dialogue that was to my advantage, because really exposition heavy dialogue just feels unnatural. But sometimes you can solve those problems with just a quick line of haven't talked to my mom in years, whatever, right? And that gives you a little bit of backstory about this character. And sometimes it is solvable that way. So it's less about leaving something out and making a hard choice about what to sacrifice, and more of how can I do this in a way that stays within the 90 to 120 pages of a script. It's that challenge. So it's challenging yourself to think of different ways to accomplish a thing. Good question. Yeah.
What is a screenwriter's relationship like with a director? Like, are you on a project until its completion, or like, are they allowed to take liberties with your writing? Like, how does that work?
That is a fantastic question, and I'm glad you asked it. So a thing that I do as a screenwriter is that in the deal initially, I 90% of the time want to be on as a producer because I also produce. But generally speaking, the screenwriter's work is done when the script is done. They're often on set in case a rewrite is needed. If something's just not working, the director might go, okay, we're both seeing this. This is not happening. What if we added a line, something like this? And they're going to take that. The script supervisor is going to note that along with a lot of other things to take that into account so that it goes into the final script. But generally, they're going to have a bunch of meetings early on to share. The director's going to say, this was my initial vision upon reading this, or can you clarify this part? This doesn't, I want to make sure I'm getting this right? If it's an adaptation, especially, I think they might both meet separately or together with the original writer of the source material to make sure that intention is there. But it's usually, once production starts, it's fairly hands-off. Like, they might be accessible on set, but then for the most part, you wait until you're invited to the premiere. And you hope for the best, and you hope you're like, oh man, I'm sorry, my name's on that. No, it's usually, it's exciting to see how your work has been interpreted. But there is an exercise in letting go, right? Just as the example of, like, Mary looked out the window and realized she loved Brian, right? You do have to trust your actors. And a misstep I see a lot with early career screenwriters is pissing off a director or an actor you've never even met yet. And by that I mean directing from the page. You want to make it clear what the action is, but there's a difference between a script and a shooting script. Your shooting script has your cut to, like, not cut to, but like your close up on, things like that. And my kind of the general rule is, unless you're going to put all of the camera angles, and because you know them all, because you're working with a director of photography, put 0 camera angles. Telling a director, close up on so-and-so, is limiting the director, because what you might be trying to say is, I want it clear that this guy realizes we need a bigger boat because that shark is huge, right? It might be that. But allow that director to get there where, in the way that they, in the way that they can, because they might have a way better idea because that's their jam. That's what they do. They do it, and they do it in that way. So I see a lot of times screenwriters will like micromanage a director before there's even a director attached to it, which can be problematic. But to swing that back around to answer your question, generally it's pretty hands-off once the script is finalized. And then you wait, and you hope for the best when you see it. Yeah, great question. Yeah. Wow. The best genre to turn into a movie. Whew. Well, I think it's the one that speaks to you, that you feel like all those elements are in, and like the kind of movie you like to see. Because that's really, I don't mean to be goofy about that, but like that's what's gonna pull you through that process, because you got to be really, really invested in it. And it all depends on like how you're gonna define best. If to me, I'm thinking about the artist as worker, so I want it to be nourishing and rewarding and feel good for you, the writer. But if you're defining best like I want a beach house in Malibu, then the answer is superhero movies for sure. And especially one with like 15 series kind of thing, right? Because we've all seen those Marvel movies make money, right? But yeah, generally it's going to be what speaks to you. I love when people find really cool, just really original ideas. You know, there's nothing wrong with a good rom-com. There's nothing wrong with a good historical drama, any of those things. But it's just kind of cool when people really rethink. You know, I asked somebody who was it, my crime and punishment person, right? I said, would you keep it in modern? Would you keep it at that time, or would you make it modern? I think that's kind of interesting. It's always interesting to play with, like with what I'm trying to do. Is it best served keeping true to the work, or is there something fun? Would it be more creatively nourishing for me to make a twist on it? If I made the cast all female, if I, you know, changed some major element of it, if I made it a rom-com, if I made it funny, you know. I mean, we see that with every type of iteration of Romeo and Juliet. There's so many versions of that, right? Like West Side Story. There's, you know, there's an R&J right there. But it really, I think, comes down to like what's going to pull you through it and what's going to keep you going through it. It's a good question, though. Yeah. What else? Yeah. You're next.
Wait, did you call?
Oh, you were just suggesting. Sorry. Yeah.
Did you call me?
I did.
So I've heard of, well, everyone's heard of book to movie adaptations, but I've also heard of like movie novelizations.
Yes.
I know like Star Wars has plenty of those, and I imagine some other popular films do too. So I'm wondering if the process would kind of be similar to, like, if you could translate the processes of creating a book to film, if those same principles can apply film to book.
Yeah, you would reverse engineer that thing. Whereas you had to come up with a visual for Mary realizing she loves Brian, you'd have to go write a chapter about Mary's process for realizing she loves Brian, right? It would be that process. But since you bring that up, the thing that I'm surprised does not exist more, or at all maybe, is when you pitch a television show, when you write that script, you have to write a show Bible, which is essentially the entire story of that series. It's huge. It's a binder. It's giant. It's very hard to write, but you got to do that for a TV show. And I am so surprised because those are done. I mean, that's a narrative. I'm so surprised that there aren't more of like this TV show in novel form, and what that would do. I think, who knows? Maybe as the strike continues, maybe that'll be a thing people start doing because they exist. But yeah, I would reverse engineer that to answer your question. Yeah, you would just have to take the visual elements out and make that more of an internal experience again for those characters. Good luck if you want to do that. That seems like a lift. No. Yeah.
You talked about how one writer you worked with was like had consistent conclusions about cutting out the mother's character.
Uh-huh.
So I'm curious if you ever worked with a writer who was more resistant to certain changes and how you navigated that.
Yeah. So I recommend always having a creative agreement for, even if it's your best friend. If nothing else, it's a great exercise in just talking through what to do if. And so I have a really easy little deal, like a form that it's some legalese, but it's softened over the years, that I use with every person I collaborate with. And we ultimately decide, it makes you kind of talk through things, but the thing that I think is always the most valuable is if we disagree, who gets that decision? And in that case, with that particular work, we kind of decided if it was about because she was coming in fully admitting, hey, I've never written a screenplay, you're teaching me. If it was about production stuff, that decision would be mine if we disagreed. If it was about integrity of the story stuff, that would be hers because that was her lived experience. I'm trying to think of, I can't say I've ever had a bad collaboration experience, really. I can think of examples where it was like, I really think this needs to happen. And the way we got through that was we kind of did like the mini table read. Reading your work aloud is humongously useful for any genre, but I think especially for screenplay, it's very useful because things that work great in your head are like, wow, that joke did not work at all. And, when you're reading it out loud. But sometimes reading it, sometimes having a third person and not giving them, like, I think Mary should not love Brian, and she thinks she should, whatever. Read this page and, give us a little feedback. That can sometimes be a thing of not like tiebreaker, but a little like what's going on here? What's important to happen next? That can be useful. Don't collaborate with people you argue with a lot. Might be kind of useful for that. Another thing we did though that reminds me of, when I was collaborating on that particular story, because it was a memoir, and it's about abuse, and it's about who this person was in 1981. Early on in the process, we were having conversations like, okay, but when you met him, did this happen? And it was real triggering to her. So we made a decision to rename that character. And so that we could talk about her as a character and talk about her in third person. Because we were talking, there's some big themes in that book, right? There's a lot of abuse stuff going on. There's a young person figuring out what their life is about and then taking it another direction because it's not going the right way. There's a lot of really personal decisions in that book. So we changed, instead of saying you, as we were talking about stuff, we changed that character's name to Dev. So Dev just became this other person and we could talk about her. And then the conversation became like, what do you think Dev thought when she met him? And it wasn't so much like, why didn't you realize he was, it wasn't like that. It became a lot smoother. So tools like that I think can be useful too. Yeah, good question. I saw you, then you. Okay.
I actually do have a question.
Yeah.
What do you think the difference is between something that'll be good as like a TV show and something that'll be good as a movie?
Great question. Everybody hear that? The question was, what would be good as a TV show versus a movie? TV show, you want that long tail on, and you can look for beats in it. Like, does it seem like there's kind of a natural place to stop, fill up the tank again, and do it again? And I think that's really the key. Is it one big story or should it be broken up? What's fun about TV right now, right? Streaming shows are so cinematic and so beautiful. So I think for directors right now, you get to make basically a 6-hour movie, if you got a season in you. You get to do all these kind of cool things. But to me, it's really about, is there a natural place to stop, refill, reset, pick it up again, stop, refill, reset, and is that sustainable for a long place? I'm really fascinated. I watched the show. It's been around for a few years, called The Guest Book. Did anybody see that? It's about an Airbnb. It's about an Airbnb cabin in the woods. And so there's the guy at the bottom of the hill who has the key. He's there every episode. And you have a little subplot of like he and his wife, they've been together a long time trying to spice things up. There's like a business down the hill that, like, it's a small little town. So there's a business down the hill run by a really diabolical person who's kind of trying to plot against everybody. But you essentially have a totally new cast every single episode. And so what they were able to do with the show is get some really, big names in there to, like, it's just one episode. It's easy shoot, no big deal. But I think that's kind of a fun tool as a writer because you get to completely reset with something like that. If it's about the location and not the story, not like a family or something, it's a totally different story. Like, you had the first episode is like a guy in there trying to save his marriage. The next episode is like a guy with a little kid and he's trying to introduce the kid to the fiance and they do not like each other, right? So he's like in this Airbnb with, 2 important women in his life and it's not going well. And then the next one, like a retiring couple, completely different stories. So things like that feel kind of fun, but it's such a reset at the end. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like the Twilight Zone. We know it's going to be something super weird and kind of creepy, but it's going to be totally different every time. Yeah.
How would you say is like the pressure, like if you had to make the film or something off of like a series that's like already been done and also already been moved into this, so how would you say like you would deal with like the pressure of writing that?
Like a remake? Oof.
Like for instance, like the Anne Rice series
Mhm.
when they had like Amy Güth and everybody movie and then they made it into a TV
Oh,
show.
yeah, yeah. I think it'd be fine because I think it's the same kind of deal. Like I don't feel like I'm in competition with the book when I do the screenplay and even I think the screenplay and the movie are two different things ultimately, right? They're their own standalone thing. I think it's fine to, I mean, you want to familiarize yourself with it, but also like I think if I were doing that, right? If I were in that position, I would say, okay, what exists? What spun off from it? What was adapted already? And then, okay, but what speaks to me about this, and why do I want to adapt it? Is it that I think I can do better? Like, okay, then fair, but maybe that's not going to be the thing that's going to get me to the finish line in a really sustainable way. I might kind of go, okay, what do I want to, is it that something's missing? Is it that I think there's a bigger narrative piece that I need to lift the lid on that hasn't really been unpacked enough? Or do I want to put a twist on it? You know, is there, I mean, I think like the example that pops in my head is like the female Ghostbusters. They gave some nods to the original, right? But they also were like playful and cheeky about it and kind of did their own thing, right? And that's fair. I mean, we recognize the things that made them the Ghostbusters, the zippy, what are those? The jumpsuit things, right? The uniform. We had those elements there, but for the most part, they kind of did their thing and worked with what was available to them and what was interesting about it. So I think like being playful and having those updates, that's fine, that's cool, and that's what makes that work yours. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
You touched on this a little bit already, but I'm interested to know how your journalistic work
Uh-huh.
influences your screenwriting and vice versa.
Yeah, I personally think that going into screenwriting as a journalist is a superpower because I spent 6 years writing with a police scanner in my head, having to write well and accurately with a lot of chaos around me. So the first time I wrote a screenplay on a deadline, I didn't know that I had like a year. And I turned around in a month and a half, and they were like, "Are you on meth? Like, how did you do that so fast? What's your deal?" But I was just kind of like used to churning things out really fast because I think as journalists we kind of don't have to feel a certain way to write. We know we got to write every day, no matter if we feel like it. And I mean, that's a gift that journalism gave me that I can just sit down and, you know, kind of do it. Also with screenwriting, it's really rewarding because you're like, man, I knocked out 20 pages. Okay, it's easier to get to 20 pages, right, with a screenplay. Like doing that in, you know, just writing narrative or fiction or something, 20 pages, that's a slog. But I think it made speed for sure. And then that other piece that I mentioned of having generally always met people on the worst and best days of their lives. There's an example script that I use in a workshop that I teach sometimes about screenwriting of in the scene, a guy walks into a room and he has a colleague that's visibly pregnant. And so I kind of like, before I show people the scene, I have them like, okay, what's the first line of dialogue? And it's interesting what people name. And it's usually something like, wow, when are you due? That's usually, but once in a while, someone will come up with a scene that's like, and my favorite thing anyone ever took with that prompt was like, Jennifer, I know David's not the father. Like, okay, that's interesting. And that's like jumping right into the thing, right? And so I think like jumping right into the thing is kind of cool because, oh, when are you due? April? That's cool. That's nice. Okay, well, you having a boy and girl? Oh, gender's the social construct. Haha. Anyway, by the way, I know that's not the father. Like, you could cut all that out and just like get right to the thing, which I think is like a gift that journalism kind of gave. Probably the other piece of it is in the stage directions, in the acting, or in the action of a script. Because journalists are so obsessed with, okay, right, but then what happened? Right, but did you reach up or did you reach down? But how did you get the tennis racket here? How did this go, right? We're so obsessed with those kind of details that I think we're not just like, and then she hit him over the head with a tennis racket. We're like, she lifted it, and then, right, like I think details come in a different way like that. Also, if a thing that I find myself doing, if I'm writing about a thing, I will, in parentheses, just to get through it, because writing, brain, and research, brain are two different places, I'll often put, fact check this. when it, not even like a claim like so and so was the 20th president. No. I'll do a thing like, is that really how this piece of science works or something? Is that actually a drug that could kill a person or whatever? I'll put a thing in there like that and then spend an unbelievable amount of time figuring out if that's accurate, when plenty of scripts would be fine if it's just like, she gave him poison in the teacup or whatever. Like, I'll go figure out, like, what would it be? Would that be, is it activated by heat or not? Or, I would get, like, really nerdy and ridiculous about it. But, yeah, but I'd say that for the most part, dialogue and speed are the gifts that journalism gave me. Yeah.
I hate to cut this short, but we are at time. Is there one more? No?
No, we answered it all.
We figured it all out.
We
And
figured
thank
out
you, Jamie,
everything.
and thank you, Amy Güth, for that wonderful.
Thank you, everybody. So let's find each other on social media and all that good stuff, and I'll be friends, and I can't wait to see all of your films. Great. Thank you.
Amy will be speaking again